everyone, it's Alice, and today I'm gonna review all of the books that I read in June. The first book that I read was The 40 Rules of Love by Elif Shafak, and this is like fiction slash historical fiction, and in it we meet a woman named Ella who has a husband and 3 children and a pleasant home, but she feels that there's this emptiness in her life, and she starts reading this manuscript about a 13th century poet and his companion, and through reading this manuscript she finds a sort of solution to the emptiness in her life. I've previously read one other book by this author, and when I read that book, a lot of people recommended this book to me, which is why I got it and why I read it. And out of the 2 that I've read, the other one, which is called 10 minutes 38 seconds in this strange world, is still my favorite out of the 2, even though I did enjoy this. There's something about the way this author writes that I just adore. I love the way she conjures up settings and the way she creates characters, and we get really deep into their minds and hearts, and we get to follow them on their paths for a little while. And in this particular story, we explore faith and truth and love, all in a really interesting way. And there's something about the way this author writes that really makes me reflect on things. This is the kind of book where we get to read from 2 different perspectives. So we have like a contemporary perspective and a historical one. And I found myself much more drawn to the historical one. Like, I preferred that one over the contemporary one. And although I enjoyed this, I found myself losing more and more interest the further into this we got. And it's just because I'm just not the kind of reader that cares about like romantic plot lines, and towards the end that's very much what we focus on, both in the historical perspective and the contemporary one. And so I got a little bit bored towards the end because I just wasn't that interested in that. But I think that's just like me and my preferences. I do also think that this is a tad too long, and it does drag out in parts, but the writing is really good and the story is good. It's just not like completely my jam. So I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. I liked it a lot, but I didn't love it. Secondly, I read Good Neighbors by Joanne Serling, and this is like contemporary fiction, and it's about these 4 families who live in the same neighborhood, and they all form this like clique because they're kind of friends because they're at the same places in their lives and they have kids the same age, and everything's great until one of the families decide to adopt a child, and everyone starts questioning if this child is being treated well. I'm not going to talk about this book too much because it just wasn't for me. Like, maybe this is great for other readers, but for me this just did nothing. This is the kind of book that barely has any storyline, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I just found the characters in here so uninteresting and boring, and there was just nothing to like keep me intrigued. And I kept going because, first of all, this book is quite short and it's quite a quick read, but I figured that something exciting was bound to happen towards the end. But then I got to the end and sure enough, stuff happens, but at that point I just didn't care. I also really didn't get on with the writing style in this. It felt really choppy to me and almost like it was trying to do something and then it didn't work, and yeah. This just didn't do anything for me, so I gave it 1 star. Then I picked up a poetry book, and it is Going In With Flowers by Avril Joy. This was actually sent to me by the author because she knew that I loved her other book so much, which is called Sometimes a River Song. This is quite different from that. It's like non-fiction poetry, and it's all about the author's experience of working in a female prison for over 2 decades. And it's about her experience and sort of giving voice to these women who live behind bars. This was intense and interesting and beautiful, and it's kind of different from a lot of other poetry collections that I've read. It's split into different parts, and each part is introduced by the author. So the author will write a couple of pages about like her experience of working in this prison and different parts of it and a lot of the people she came into contact with, and that part gives sort of an introduction to the poetry that you're about to read. So it gives you more context and it makes the poetry easier to understand and to connect to, and it makes it feel kind of deeper in a way, and I loved that. This discusses women and womanhood, life behind bars, and just humanity in general, and it gets quite dark sometimes, which I really liked. I felt like it worked really well. I knew when I started reading this though that I needed to take my time with it, because I feel like you should allow yourself the time to sort of soak these poems in, and I really tried to take my time with it, and I also ended up reading a lot of these poems out loud, which worked really well for me. I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. It was great and slightly brutal, and I would really recommend it if you like poetry in general, and especially if you like sort of memoir style poetry. Moving on to something a little bit lighter, I read A Shot in the Dark by Lynn Truss. This is a historical fiction mystery, and it's set in Brighton in the 1950s, a couple of years after this violent gang fight took out 2 of the biggest gangs in the city. And since then, the inspector of the police department has been convinced that there is no crime left in the city, and he is like, he doesn't want to see it. So when this new constable comes to work for them and he starts investigating this series of burglaries and this murder of a theater critic, this inspector gets really annoyed. This was an easy, funny, and enjoyable cozy mystery, but to be honest, I don't know if this has made much of a lasting impression on me. The things that I liked about this the most was probably the setting, and that I enjoyed reading about the characters. I thought that a lot of them were really interesting, even if some of them are kind of stereotypical, and I do think that there are too many characters in this book, and like especially towards the end, all of them are in the story at once, and I didn't really love that. I do also love the tone of this book. It's pretty funny and it keeps everything light even through like murder and mayhem. I do think that this takes a little bit too long to get going though, and there were some things about like the pacing of this that I didn't really love. Like I think that the things that happen in this book could have been spaced out better somehow, and it's not the kind of book that like makes you intrigued right away, if that makes sense. It was like enjoyable though, but not particularly memorable for me, so I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. This is the first book in a series, and I probably will not keep going with the series because I just have a lot of other series that I'm reading and I don't need to read this one. Next, I read Drown by Junot Diaz, and this is a short story collection. It has 10 stories, most of which are like coming of age stories, and these are set like in the Dominican Republic, and then they move on to being set in New Jersey. So this one was pretty good, but I think that maybe I wasn't in the mood for it when I started reading this book. I don't know if that maybe made me enjoy it less, but I liked it, but this just didn't like blow me away. All of the stories in here are interlinked, and most of them follow the same characters, which I really liked because we really get to know the characters and we get to revisit them in different parts of their life, and we sort of know where they come from and why they are the way they are. The stories explore familial relationships and the experience of growing up and sort of having to carry with you everything that you've experienced throughout your life. I think that the writing style in here is good, although I didn't love it like all the time, but I think I would like to read something else by this author. Like, I think he's written some novels, and maybe I would like his writing more in like a longer format, because even though the characters sort of bring this whole short story collection together, a lot of the stories felt very jumbled to me, and I think that threw me off a little bit. I do love the themes that are explored in this book though, and that was maybe my favorite part. So I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. I'm glad that I read it, and if any of you have read any other books by this author, let me know. Second to last, I read How to Be a Victorian by Ruth Goodman. This is a nonfiction history book, and it explores the life of a Victorian. So it takes us through the day of a Victorian and what it would have been like from getting up in the morning all throughout the day until the end of it. This was both really fun and educational, and Going into this, all I really knew about Victorian England were like the bits and pieces I've picked up at school, and then I've seen, you know, movies and TV series, which aren't always accurate, so I really learned a lot from this. I really do think this was just great. Like, it gives us a look into the day of an everyday Victorian. And one of the things that I really like about this book is that it talks about not just what Victorian life would have been for the upper class, but like the upper class and the middle class and like poor and working class families, which I really appreciated. And this takes us through like everything they would have gone through in a day. So like getting up, getting dressed, what their clothes would have been made of, and like makeup and breakfast and school and exercise and like everything that would be a part of a Victorian's every day. The writing in here is easy to understand and easy to read, and it is very detailed, but I really enjoyed that. And I really like how the author has like peppered in her own experiences of like trying out different things that are mentioned in this book. I thought that added something a little extra special to it. There are also like loads of illustrations throughout this book, which makes it even more fun to read. Overall, this was just fun and interesting, and I really enjoyed it, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars, and I would really recommend it if you're interested in this time period. It is very detailed though, so just bear that in mind. Lastly, we're ending on a high note because I read one of my favorite books that I've read this year, and it is Three Stones Make a Wall by Eric H. Klein. This is a nonfiction book, and it's all about archaeology. The author of this is an archaeologist with over 30 years of experience, and this explores archaeology as a field from its conception to its current form. It talks about how archaeologists work and used to work, and we get to take a look at numerous archaeological sites throughout the world. You know that feeling when you start a book and it turns out to be exactly what you've been looking for? It's a very satisfying feeling, and that's exactly the experience that I had with this. What I wanted from this was an interesting look into the field of archaeology and how it used to be done and how it's done now, and that's exactly what this is. I loved all of the history in here and getting to learn about like ancient humans and what they were like and why we think they were the way that we think they were, and I loved getting to see all of the different sites that we visit in this book, both the ones that I'd heard of and the ones that I hadn't. The writing in here is easy, it's sort of conversational, and there's a lot of information in this book, but it's handled very well, so it makes it very readable and like easy to understand. I did try to take my time with this because there is a lot of information in here, and I tried to like take time to let everything sink in because I feel that I often need that when I'm reading like nonfiction that has a lot of stuff in it. There are also illustrations throughout this book, which I really enjoyed. I think it made for a better reading experience, and I ended up Googling a lot of things while reading this, which was really fun. I think this works great as an introduction to this field and all of these different sites. And it's not the kind of book that goes like really in depth about everything. It very concisely tells you about the most fascinating parts of different digs and different parts of the field of archaeology. And I enjoyed it so much that I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. This was a great place to start for me, and it's made me want to read so many more books about different like sites that I've read about in this and different people, and yeah, it was just amazing. I'm gonna keep this book and reread it in like maybe a year or something because I enjoyed it that much. Okay everyone, those were all of the books that I had to talk about today. I'd love to know what you all have been reading for the past month, and as usual, links to my Patreon and other social media will be in the description if you're interested, and I will see you soon.